Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India as well with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. The Maldives wants India to withdraw military helicopters and personnel posted there following the expiry of an agreement in June, its envoy said, the latest snub to New Delhi by President Abdullah Yameen's China-backed government. India and China are going head-to-head in the Maldives, the Indian Ocean island chain, where Beijing is building roads, bridges and a bigger airport upstaging India, which has been the country's prime provider of military and civilian aid for decades. India has opposed Yameen's crackdown on political rivals and the imposition of an emergency this year, and some of the president's rivals have called on New Delhi for military intervention, creating worries in the Maldivian government. The tensions are impacting aid programs such as security assistance that New Delhi has given to smaller countries in the region to help them protect exclusive economic zones, carry out surveys and combat piracy. On this edition of India's World, we will take a closer look at the India-Maldives ties. Joining me on the program today are Professor S.T. Muni, Foreign Affairs expert, Suresh K. Goel, former ambassador, and Commander Abhijit Singh, Head Maritime Policy Initiative Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Professor, let me begin the program with you. What are the circumstances which have led to the latest issue between India and Maldives?
Well, you should look at it as a part of the series of developments which have taken place. And at the root of all these developments is the internal power struggle within Maldives. I think Mr. Yameen has always felt a sense of insecurity that perhaps India and the international community is supporting some of his challengers, be that his own stepbrother Yameen, or Nasheed, who was the earlier president. And this is where he sought support from the Chinese, who were more than willing to get into Maldives for their own reasons. And he exploited that. To some extent, the story started with GMR, the company which was working there for airport construction, which ran into problems. Then they had arbitration in which they won the case, but they were thrown out of Maldives, and it was a big investment, I think, running into hundreds of millions of dollars.
500 million, I think.
500, and later on, it added to that also. Therefore, the internal politics in Maldives seems to be polarized along India-China on the one hand, along, I would say, even Islamist and a more liberal and secular content on the other. And President Yameen finds India is standing on the other side of the line where he needs support. That's the main reason behind it. I mean, giving helicopters back, not conceding even India's suggestions on emergency extension, throwing the judges and the political leaders into the prison, so many things, butchering democracy. There are so many issues involved. So it's not only a helicopter which is hurting us. And that's why you would recall that Prime Minister has not yet visited Maldives while he has visited all other neighboring countries.
Indeed. You know, Commander Abhijit Singh, is the real issue the helicopters or the Indian personnel on the ground in Maldives, really?
Yeah, well, there's actually two dimensions to this problem that we're facing in the Maldives. One is that although India-Maldives ties have frayed for a while, and that's not really news that the relationship is headed south, there is a degree of sort of bellicosity in Maldives' approach to India in the way that they're playing their foreign policy. And there's been a number of developments, and the professor here has pointed out to some of them. But let me just say this. On the security side, the main dilemma as far as India is concerned is this. India and China, both countries have a presence in Maldives, but the presence is of a qualitatively different nature. India has some security personnel posted in a northern atoll and in a southern atoll. The northern atoll is called Kadu, and the southern atoll is called Adu. Now, the Chinese also have presence around those atolls. So the Chinese have apparently been offered to build a port in a southern atoll by the name of Lamu. and the Maldivians are on record having said that we are positively considering this offer. Now, Indian suspicions are that there is already some movement that has begun as far as building of those ports are concerned, and the Chinese have already inserted some security personnel in the guise of workers, etc. In the northern side, the Chinese have set up what is called as a maritime observatory. Now, the Chinese have a similar sort of observatory in the South China Sea, which is dual purpose, used both for civilian and military activities. India's, again, suspicion is that that observatory might also be used to keep a tab on the 8-degree channel that actually separates Minicoy from Maldives. Now, now the real problem is this, that the Maldivians have made it clear to us that we don't want you to be keeping a tab or keeping track of Chinese activities in either the northern atolls or the southern atolls. And both are helicopters. One is in the northern atoll, the other is in the southern atoll. So they want our helicopters out. But really, it's not about the helicopters. It's really about the personnel. We have about 45, 50 personnel, around that much. A couple of pilots. They want these people out because they think that in the guise of doing EEZ patrols, etc., the Indians are actually keeping a track of Chinese activities in the region. Now, why is that a problem? Because the Chinese activities, a lot of the Chinese activity is actually not legit. There is no sovereign guarantees that have been given for it. The pacts are not very clear. So Maldives does not want to come under a shadow of suspicion about the kind of interaction that it has with China. Therefore, the security dimension of this is very important because we are being signaled to by Maldives that it's not comfortable with Indian presence in its seas and it wants India out.
Indeed. Ambassador, let me bring you to the picture now. As far as the India-Maldives ties are concerned, do you believe they are heading in a direction where there's not going to be any kind of a repair? It's heading south, and it's going to be difficult to contain in the near future.
Well, I mean, as of the moment, they're heading south simply because, like Professor Muni said, that as far as the current president of Maldives is concerned, essentially, there is a bit of an insecurity in his own mind about the internal political dynamics. He continues to feel threatened by his predecessor, Nasheed, and therefore, and because Nasheed has been very, very close to India, he does believe that any Indian presence actually could be causing political insecurity and instability to his own continuation. In terms of security, Abhijit has really put in the picture very nicely, really speaking. And I think the fact is that I will not be surprised if Maldives is actually doing it at instigation from the Chinese presence over there, because they do feel threatened by the presence of the Indian security personnel. I think given all the circumstances and the fact that it's mostly caused by Yameen himself rather than any other factors in Maldives per se, I would tend to believe that even though the relationship is heading south at the moment, it is more the doing of the current president than anything else. So the elections are due, as you know, and the new opposition candidate has declared that they will not hurt the Chinese interest. But those are the things which I said before the elections. Naturally, it's an important relationship. I think we will need to really keep a watch till the next election as to what happened. But till Yameen continues and till he has this insecurity, yes, the relationship is heading south.
The relationship is heading south, Professor, and heading south rapidly. How did all of this happen? Because up until a few years ago, of course, Chinese presence was minimal in Maldives, but all of a sudden we've seen China overtaking India and Maldives.
Well, China started knocking on Maldives' doors way back in, I would say, 2008, 2009, but 2010 or 11, even Nasheed allowed the Chinese to set up an embassy. So the Chinese have I would say, a grand plan for Indian Ocean. This came after Hambantota project, which they had got from Sri Lanka. And the story, therefore, of the Chinese interest in Maldives is an old one. But why it is that they have got far more leverage in last 5 years is because of the internal political struggle. Now, Chinese interest and the way situation is developing in Maldives, as I said, Yameen always suspected, and probably India had sympathies for Nasheed, though we were also party or we endorsed his being thrown out, did not save him. I would say, if I go back to, I had written on this. Secondly, the Maldives politics internally is largely divided on the tourism sector. where they set out these small islands for resorts and all that, and their main income largely is from and this is where Nasheed ran into difficulties with Yameen and his brother Gayoom, and they joined hands to throw Nasheed out, and it was done in quite an illegal manner. Even now, Yameen is almost butchering diplomacy. You would recall Prime Minister Modi's interview yesterday in
the
Times of India, in which he said that democratic institutions should not be damaged in any way. And what he was hinting at, the way Election Commission is functioning, mind it, the elections are almost a month ahead.
September 23rd,
23rd of September,
yes.
which is a month and 10 days or whatever you call it. And therefore, Yameen wants to go to the town by making India as an election issue. He made election India as an issue even in 2013, when I said that the company is GMR.
GMR, yes.
GMR, which were building the airport there. And they went and said that this is the contract given to GMR is favoring India and this and that. I think they will make this issue again very sharp in internal politics, largely because Yameen is feeling threatened since all the opposition parties have got united. You know, they have formed what you call the joint opposition. There was a fear that Nasheed would contest, but Nasheed was not acceptable to some other, of course not to the Yameen, but even to the Jamhuri party, and therefore they have forced and put up a new candidate who is acceptable to everybody. That gives a little, scare to President Yameen, that since all the opposition is united, he has terrible minority within the parliament, and that's why he has been ransacking institutions, parliament or election commission or judiciary. He has thrown out the judges who gave a judgment in favor of the opposition. There are so many things which have happened.
Yes.
Therefore, on the whole, what he is doing now at the moment is partly for using it in elections. That is what I feel. Whereas the disease is much old, as I said.
Right.
It started with at least 2010, 2011.
Right. You know, Ambassador, why is it that the Maldives is favoring China more than India at the moment? Is it a failure on India's diplomacy?
So I think India faces a very, very difficult situation as far as Maldives is concerned. Any action taken by Maldives would, considering that Maldives is clearly getting closer to China, and if we take any action which is seen as kind of, countering Chinese influence, would be taken as a challenge to China. And therefore, we need to be very cautious in on the kind of options we exercise. However, I'm going to say something which I don't know whether we should say it in open or not, but the fact is that India's options are getting more and more limited. Eventually, in the Indian Ocean, where our security interests are very, very important, very, very critical, and we need to convey without any doubt to everyone in the region that whatever policy actions they exercise, they need to keep in mind the Indian sensitivities. If this message has to go, they need to understand that going against Indian sensitivities has a cost. We have not been able to impose that cost on Maldives so far. I think we need to seriously consider if, in view of this drastic action now taken, asking India to withdraw a helicopter and the personnel is not simply a question of changing the security dynamics. It's a question of conveying a message to India that as far as you are concerned, we can exist or we can do things without really caring for what you think or what your interests are. So unless we are able to take, this actually should have been said by Professor Muni, but let me say it, unless we are able to convey without any doubt a message that ignoring our sensitivities will have a cost, I think we will have to really then, it's better.
Yeah, so a tough message needs to be sent out.
Message does need to go.
Needs to be sent out not just to Maldives, to the other Indian Ocean island nations.
I think
also
at the moment, I think other countries in Indian Ocean we have comfortable relations with them. They have come to understand what actually the interests are and everything. With the exception of one country, Pakistan, every other country really we don't have to. But I think the country to which the message has to go is really Maldives.
All right. You know, Commander, let's taking a cue from what the ambassador just said. You know, our relationship with Maldives, does it have any bearing with the other Indian Ocean island nations?
Well, Maldives is a separate case. Maldives, I believe, would have been a problem had it not been this government, any other government also, because Maldives was headed in that direction. But that said,
it's because of the internal problems, like the professor was talking about.
The fact that there's a past struggle on in that country, there's a problem of radical Islam, issues that are beyond India's control. And I believe it's just not the present dispensation, but even the Manmohan Singh government that had faced similar challenges in around 2011, 2012, when, remember, President Nasheed had actually been pulled out of office on gunpoint. And India had actually, as one analyst said the other day, chosen to look the other way. We didn't actually do very much at that point. And so the slide, I believe, had begun at that point. But that said, I will say that this is also a particularly complicated situation because of the policy choices that we have made. For instance, in the case of, if you look at the fact that that we have not been able to somehow send this message across strongly to Maldives that this is our sphere of influence, and that that any such action that is taken by smaller states that in some ways harms India's interests will not be taken well by India. You see, the fact is that one or two things need to be said here, that there was in between a choice given to India, or maybe this choice was there on the table, that India can move its helicopters to Diego Garcia. But the reason we have not been able to do so is because on Diego Garcia, which is in Chagos Islands, we have taken a position in the UN wherein we have actually supported Mauritius's claim. And if we are actually going to shift our helicopters to Diego Garcia, that will mean that we are actually supporting the US and the UK's position on Diego Garcia. So it will in some ways counter our own foreign policy stance. Also, if you look at the fact that the Chinese and the Pakistanis have made the most of India's absence in Maldives. The Pakistani army chief was there recently. They're not thinking of doing EEZ patrols in those waters. And what's really interesting is that as per Maldivian law, no foreign ship can actually transit those waters without the explicit permission of the Maldivian government. That will mean that the Pakistanis and the Maldivians will ensure that the Indian ships are actually not passing through the EEZs. So it's to a great extent also has to do with the way we have approached the problem, not taken remedial measures in time.
All right. You know, that having been said, Professor, what should our approach be going forward?
No, this is, I think we should continue with this, that we are not very clear what can we do and to what extent we can trust our willpower to say that things should change. I'll give you the latest example. The latest example is the vote for Maldives in the United Nations Security Council, where it was seeking a non-permanent membership. 2 days before the vote, or 3 days before the vote, we gave them in writing that we are voting for you. Eventually they lost, and they lost badly. And in between was Prime Minister's visit to Indonesia, which won. And therefore, despite our being given in writing, every Maldivian establishment component believes that we did not vote them or we did not support them. Now, if we know that Maldives is working against us, where is the need for us to reassure them that we are going to vote for you? I mean, it's a past history of at least 4 to 5 years that the Maldivians have been showing us thumb in one way or the other. Now, where is the point we have tried to, what we have done is, one option is that I think your Navy is probably capable, Abhijit will tell us, and even might have hinted that we can go and, project force in that area.
Is that a viable option though?
No, which the political decision did not allow it. So it did not happen. It is not a viable in the sense that it would say India as an intruder or interventionist internationally. Now, Maldives is not only working against India, let me make it very clear. In Maldives foreign policy, of course, India is a major factor, China is a major factor, but there is an alliance taking place Pakistan was mentioned there. Saudi Arabia needs to be mentioned because of the Islamic character.
No, since you brought up Saudi Arabia, Professor, what kind of influence does Saudi Arabia still wield on Maldives?
Just a minute. Besides Saudi, on the other side, besides India, they are also terribly unhappy with the US and UK. And mind it, UK was the best supporter of Nasheed. Now, so far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, is giving a lot of money and encouragement to the Islamist forces. There are reports that about 200 plus Maldivians have been recruited by the IS. And the other day, in one of the museums in Maldives, these Islamists went and shattered the statues of the Hindu and Buddhist gods. And nothing was done against them. Now, therefore, the money which is coming up, diplomatic support, in fact, Maldives severed or restrained its relations with Iran largely to please the Saudi Arabians. So, Saudi Arabians have a very strong influence on Maldives. Pakistan has a very strong influence. Now, of course, China has a great financial stakes also so far as Maldives is concerned. So, Maldives leadership is very intelligently exploiting the international polarization which has taken place, in which India is the most damaged kind of relationship which we are facing today. So, I think we must understand this context, and this being the context, you simply go and intervene militarily into the situation would not take us. We have been trying to work through their internal institutions, like the judiciary voted against the president by saying all the opposition, and next day he took away those judges and got the decision changed by the same judiciary except the two judges. We have been trying to work through the election commission. The real problem is that Yameen still has a very strong influence with the army and police, which is the decisive factor. And it seems that we have not been able to work on there. So unless internally Yameen the base is eroded, I don't see an immediate answer to the present problem.
All right. Abhijit, since the professor brought up China, let's talk about the China model now, and is it sustainable in Maldives? Because we know what the China model is at the end of the day. We've seen it run into problem in Pakistan, CPEC, of course, locals seem to be against it. In Malaysia as well, we saw the Chinese projects, running into trouble. Will we see the same kind of trouble in Maldives, sometime in the near future?
Well, before I get to that question, let me just answer this question about boots on the ground. This is something that always comes up when you're discussing Maldives. Can we send boots on the ground? I believe the answer to that is no. At this moment in time, I don't think we can actually send in troops. We can't intervene militarily. But having said that, I would also say that there is space for power projection. And the way to project power is to send in your ships, do some gunboat diplomacy, strong gunboat diplomacy, surround the Maldives with heavy presence, combine that with coercive diplomacy. I believe the chief instrument that we have with us is coercive diplomacy. Go along with the US and the UK, try and impose some sanctions, travel bans, etc. So a multi-pronged approach.
How interested are the US and the UK?
So look, this is the other complicating factor, that the US at this point is a bit distracted. The US is more interested in what's happening in the South China Sea, in the Pacific, and so is the case with the other Quad partners, the Australia and Japan. But I believe the EU has moved ahead with some travel bans. The EU does not want to see any sort of force projection happening there. But I think we can combine forces with some of these elements to at least pursue an approach wherein it becomes clear to the Maldives that regardless of what the Chinese pressures on us are, we are going to move in our interest. I think at this moment what's happened is that, and this is the biggest sort of hitch in the way that we are playing our foreign policy, is that we have an ongoing reset with China itself. After the Wuhan summit, we have reached out to China. We sort of have this understanding with China that we will not cross each other's red lines. Now, the thing is that the Chinese don't need to cross our red lines because there are other people doing their bidding. The Pakistanis are crossing the red lines for the Chinese. The Maldivians are crossing the red lines for the Chinese. So we have to understand that regardless of what our understanding with China is, when it comes to our national interests, we will have to move forward and project some kind of power. Let's remember that just 6 months back, the Chinese sent in a surface action group into the Indian Ocean region. That was a clear signal to India that if you move on the Maldives, if you try and show any degree of aggression, we are going to come and get you. But to just quickly answer your question, I believe the Chinese model is create debt dependency. And it is clear to the Maldivians that the debt dependency is being created. 70% of their debt now is Chinese. But the Maldivians are happy to go with it because this is really, it's accepted now, this is a rogue regime. the Yameen government would be nowhere unless it weren't for China's clear support.
Right.
And therefore, I think that the Chinese will continue to go ahead here. They will create one or two small dual-use bases. And until the time we don't make our intent clear to Maldives and to China, we're not going to get very far.
Closing comment now from you, Ambassador, on what's the way forward for India-Maldives ties?
I think the way forward, as I said before, is that a clear message has to go to the current government in Maldives that there are limits to there are limits to really what they can do in terms of impacting on our own interests and sensitivities in the region. They should clearly understand that we will not stay quiet if those red lines are breached, number one. Number two, I don't think this is the forum to discuss the options. There are multiple options which are available. Every option has a cost. And therefore, we have to really clearly analyze what is the least expensive kind of an option. But there are a combination of costs, including coercive diplomacy, including the blockades, sanctions, limiting the access, communication lines. There are multiple things. After all, China is not as close as India is. And therefore, we have greater capacity to do things than China does. Number three, I think we must know that just before the elections, the people who are at the moment in the opposition and who have now really come together, they do look to India in terms of supporting a democratic change in the government there. And if India at this stage does look away, like it did look away from Nasheed at one time, I think we will be losing more in that area. And we need to be cautious about this thing, considering the Maldives is strategically important to us.
Okay, it's time for India to play a more proactive role is what all the panelists are suggesting. Yes, Professor.
Just one sentence there. I think we are waiting until the elections and hope that the election opposition would be able to challenge Yameen successfully. Most of these options or what should be done, I think would be the time after the elections to think as to how situation has changed.
Yeah.
Also, one last line, which is that procrastination does not help. Proactivism does. And when it comes to a situation like Maldives that clearly has a political dimension to it, but more importantly has a very heavy security dimension to it. We've got to move in time, otherwise it will be too late. And once the Chinese have already set shop in Maldives, well then we are going to be fighting a losing battle.
Okay, it's time to be proactive, it's time to act. The time to act is now is what the panelists are suggesting. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'd like to hear from you as well. You can share your feedback and your suggestions with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. See you again next time.